Hi, I'm Andrew Francis, and this is from my book Mission on the Outside, Chapter 2, Just Passing Through. John chapter 4, verses 4 to 5, we read, "And he had to pass through Samaria, so he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph." Jesus is heading for Galilee. This is the clear aim of his journey. We have no indication that the Father had told him to expect interruptions on the way. We also know Jesus made it clear to the Canaanite woman in Matthew's Gospel that he had only been sent to the lost sheep of Israel. So the fact that he had to pass through Samaria appears to be incidental to the story. And yet, like Jesus' avoidance of ingratiating himself with the crowds, it seems that some of the most powerful works of God don't actually take place at the end of a journey, but in interruptions along the way. In a number of instances in Mark's Gospel, Mark puts together two stories in such a way that they seem to resemble a sandwich. There is a piece of bread on each side, the main story, and then the filling, the second story. It is not that the bread is unimportant, it surely is, but equally important is the filling or diversion we find in the middle. In fact, some Gospel commentators would argue that this is a way in which Mark is actually trying to make a much larger point that we will fail to miss if we simply break the Gospel up into a series of smaller sections. One example of this in Mark's Gospel is the story of Jesus being approached by Jairus, a synagogue leader. Jairus requests that Jesus follow him home to lay his hands on his dying daughter. Obviously, this was an opportunity for Jesus to expand his reputation. After all, Jairus was a man of influence, and if things went well and prayers are answered, word would get out, and other movers and shakers in town would also be likely to get behind Jesus. The situation was also one of great urgency. Jairus' daughter is not just suffering from a mild fever or the chicken pox, she was dying. This called for immediate action on Jesus' part, if for no other reason than to show he shared Jairus' grave concern for his daughter. But an interruption occurs on the way to Jairus' house. Well, in some senses, it's all quite nice really, but surely not something to make too much of a fuss about. There was a lady in the crowd, probably not somebody of much influence, given the low position of women in that society, who had been suffering with bleeding for 12 years. Her bleeding meant that she was also unclean, according to the law of Moses, and shouldn't be out and about, as anybody that she touched would also have been rendered unclean too. Now let's be honest about this. Not only was this woman creating problems for others, but she has had this problem for 12 years. Even though it was probably causing a few issues for her, we have no indication that she was likely to drop off the perch like poor Jairus' daughter. On the positive side, this woman obviously had some faith in Jesus, and so she reached out from the midst of the crowd, pressing in on every side and touched the fringe of his garment. And wouldn't you know it, she was healed. Well, good on her. She took a chance. The chance paid off, and presumably she was feeling just great. Jesus, sensing that power had gone out from him, now wants to make a big deal out of it all and asks a seemingly bizarre question: who touched me? The disciples are understandably a little nonplussed about all of this. Not only are the disciples thinking, what a stupid question, considering the people hemming you in on every side, but you also suspect that they are eager for Jesus to get on and sort out Jairus' daughter. Surely this was where the real action was most likely to take place. Jesus, being his usual obstinate self, had none of it, and refused to budge until the poor, embarrassed woman came forward. I mean, really, even people with bleeding hearts would know that the last thing that this woman wants is her private matters being aired before the whole world. And so, trembling, she falls at Jesus' feet and confesses everything. Jesus told her what she probably already knew, that her faith had made her well, and sent her on her way in peace. This was probably his way of letting her know that she was clean as far as God is concerned. All very lovely and sweet. In the meantime, whilst Jesus had been creating a scene in the middle of town with this unknown woman, the synagogue leader, Jairus' daughter, had now actually died. Some of his family and friends turned up with the bad news and tell Jairus that he may as well let Jesus get on with the rest of his day because there is not a lot more that can be done now. Well, we know the rest of the story, and if we don't, we can at least read it and discover that Jesus continues on his way to Jairus' house and proceeds to raise the girl from the dead. Whilst I hear some of you saying that this raising a girl from the dead is proof of Jesus' power, and is indeed the whole point of the story, I'm not fully convinced. It smells a little like the incident with his cousin Lazarus, another bloke who died, in John's Gospel, because Jesus decided to have a couple of days' break on the way to seeing him. Even after he'd been urgently sent for, Jesus still took his time, and I'm not the least bit surprised that Martha and Mary told him off for doing so. You see, the problem for me, and I have a young daughter, is that I would prefer my daughter to be healed rather than brought back to life. The last thing I want to witness is the death of one of my kids, or even for that matter, a close relative. As much as I would love to see someone raised from the dead, I would prefer the person who was raised to be someone else's relative rather than mine. Be that as it may, and this is not really the main point of my story, this is probably just as much of a digression as the digressions Jesus made. This Jesus, who doesn't share the same fascination with crowds that we as Western Christians have, also doesn't seem as bent on getting to the end of the journey or completing the job as we are. He is more than willing to be sidetracked, interrupted, and seemingly distracted by needy nobodies on the way. Somehow Jesus has the ability to see the work of the Father even in things and people that you and I might see as taking our focus away from the real work. I remember one of the principles I heard expounded many times in church growth seminars, namely the principle that encouraged me to pour my energy only into the people who had the most ability to respond and give. There were, of course, other people, those who were considered the time wasters, the high demand, little response people that would simply demand much and would invariably give little in return, that I should do my best to avoid. Of course, this makes a lot of sense if my job is to build a successful organization with lots of functional and influential people. This also makes sense from a business perspective. No business would survive if it wastes time and money propping up lazy or dysfunctional employees. It would not have the resources to invest in its good employees or in its reason for being. But sadly, as I discovered all too late in my own ministry, the Jesus of the Gospels doesn't seem to understand or apply our commercial or church growth principles to his ministry. In fact, not only does he find time for the most hopeless and dysfunctional people, he actually goes out of his way to minister to them even over those who are more likely to make godly and influential disciples. Somehow, the fact that this story takes place in non-Israelite territory in the middle of the journey and not at the end of the journey is in itself part of the point. And of course, the fact that the story focuses on Jesus' interaction with yet another nobody provides us with more grist for the mill. But I'm getting ahead of myself here.